In 1973, I, with my partner Larry Etkin, began Center for Creative Choice. We were very much enamored with the idea that people had a variety of choices. Neither one of us accepted the diagnostic statistical manual because we believe people are just who they are. And by that time, I had read Thomas Shaw's book, The Myth of Mental Illness. And today his theory are being validated. The whole field of genetics is validating it in the sense that we now know we bring in certain parts of us, certain sub-personalities and characteristics. And we were experimenting with that idea using gestalt therapy. As I mentioned at the end of part 3, when we got to Sedona, we just fell in love with the beauty. Ironically, I also mentioned in one of the other podcasts that in 1971, when I moved to Sedona, the chairman of the Department of Counseling Psychology said to me, "Don't move there. You got to finish your dissertation first, because if you move up there and get healthy, you'll realize what a nonsense this whole doctorate program is. And you're not allowed to get healthy until after you finish your doctorate. So stay down here in the valley and grind it out." I said, "No, I got to take my kids to Sedona. I don't like the drug scene in Phoenix, and I want them to be in a small town and a beautiful place, and the drugs aren't there yet, particularly the prescription drugs." Well, he was almost right. I moved to Sedona. I had to move back to Phoenix in 1974, 4 years later, to finish my dissertation. And he was right. I had gotten healthy before I finished it. The most amazing thing was that I then thought, if we bring groups here and they get turned on by the outside, let's let them go outside in the morning, then we'll do our Gestalt groups in the afternoon. And sure enough, they loved it. And whatever issues were inside them, they began to just come forward. And that was the grist for the mill. That was the meeting for the conversations and the Gestalt experiments run during the afternoon. We usually had weekend groups, so they were there for 2 days. And once we got this going, on the very first morning, on Saturday morning, we would have them out first, then bring them into the office. He was so successful, I then said to my partner Larry, "I'm going to start Wilderness Encounter, a therapeutic journey." So beginning in 1973, I had to figure out, well, what am I doing if I'm actually going to go back to the soul of the earth, the very Mother Earth essence. And I've been such a rugged scientist that if I can't prove it by mathematics and scientific discovery, it doesn't exist. So as I said in other parts when we were talking about self, soul, spirit, I dropped out. I started to drop out in 73 and began with a trip of emancipation for me and for my son. My son from high school and beginning life, and for me for giving up 90 hours a week working, and the American dream of work as much as you can. It wasn't that I didn't like the work that I did. I loved it. The difference was I wanted to be more soul-directed. So that started the process. What began, ironically, was a 3-month trip to Mexico in 73, living on the beaches, living out of a blazer, spending a month alone on parts of the Baja in that 3 months, and other parts in desolated areas, getting the best of the ocean and the Mexican seacoast, both the Sea of Cortez and the Pacific. What was beautiful about it is I began to slow down time. Time lost its meaning. At this point then, that was the first lesson for being in the wilderness. Time has little or no meaning in the wilderness other than the signifying of a day ending and a new one beginning. What's so exciting about that is that kind of steady, easy settling in takes a while to literally be there. One of the things I learned, I'll fast forward, is that when I began to take people in the wilderness, particularly out of cities, it took them 3 days to get there. They still were in the city with all the noise and all the trappings and so forth. On about the second or third day, they said, "Oh, it's not quiet out here. I can hear birds. I can hear coyotes. I can hear the rustling in the trees. I've changed what I hear now. I don't hear ambulances and police cars and big trucks. I hear the beauty of the wilderness." And it relaxes them, it settles them right down. The beauty of the wilderness then was discovered on those trips to Mexico at 3 months, as well as the time in Sedona. And then I said, I've got to do this full time. My daughter said, and I repeat this again, I've said it before in the podcast, "Dad, you were your own first client." And I was. If I was going to take people in the wilderness, I had to go out there and explore it myself. So it took me a year or so to wind down my private practice, and I'd already given up college teaching and university teaching. And I was living very quietly and doing excursions. By 1975, I'd cleared up my life enough to move to southern Arizona. And as I said, I chose a small town. What that allowed me to do was within 70, 80 miles, climb in many of the islands in the sky, as they're called in southern Arizona, which includes the Huachucas and the Chiricahuas and the Dragoons and Santa Rita in the mountains south of Tucson. And the beauty of that was I got to take myself out 1-2 weeks at a time. I got to practice on getting in touch with my soul and the soul of the earth and make those connections. Many times I went out alone. Many times I tried different kinds of things, exercises. I went out sometimes in strict meditation and spoke very little, even to the animals. Many times I went out in fasting. And many times I went out with deep intention of self-discovery and paying attention and listening to the earth and the creatures of the earth. The amazing thing is when you go out and you don't take a lot of bright tents and you don't start big fires and you don't bang a lot of cooking utensils around and you live very quietly. Well, what happens is the animals watch you come in and they disappear for a while. After you're set up, I many times, because of the mountains having the beauty of granite rocks as well as other volcanic rocks, would hide in those rocks, and there were many opportunities to be in caves. The beauty of that was the owls that had caves right next to me would move in and we would talk all night. Then I began to converse with many other animals. When they know you're safe and they're safe with you, it's an amazing what happens. I have over 6 hours of animal stories, each one lasting less than a minute. The whole thing I'm trying to say is that you become a part of that. When you live in that natural rhythm, what happens is you're up with the sun, and after sunset you usually do meditation, watching the beautiful sunset, and then that's when you sleep. So you're sleeping those hours when the natural world comes alive for the nocturnal and goes to bed for the non. So many times I would be up at night as well and sleep sometimes in the daytime. I changed with the animals that I wanted to watch, and actually investigate. So when I dropped out in 75, I had 5 years to begin to experiment with myself, and I did. I climbed many mountains. What happened when I dropped out with no work at all, and the only time I worked was when I get low on money. And I didn't have a lot of money to begin with, so I would go to work every now and then. Many times people from Phoenix would send me clients down to southern Arizona. I began a little bit experimenting with the wilderness, but I wanted to hold off until I really knew. So in 1979, I went to a residency in Klamath Falls. But I'm here in front of this mountain to illustrate something. One of the things that happened to me between 73 and 79 is I really brought to life the wild man that's in my mandala, and the little boy, and the seeker, and that one who always wants to be curious. Those parts of my mandala were highly awakened. Prior to that, I had been my teacher minister and my science philosopher, and I was right in the middle of academics, both teaching and going all the time, working on the 5 degrees that I accumulated. That's how dedicated I was to academics. Then it became that dedicated. If you look at these mountains all around you here, what happened by 1978, the woman that I dropped out with said, "Roger, you're spending so much time now out in the wilderness and so little time with me. I believe you love the mountains more than you love me. If my behaviors are accurate, she's right. If my heart is accurate, I love them both." But she left me. She wanted more of me. And I kept calling to the mountains. And it was in these kinds of mountains that I reconnected. We've now taken mountain climbing to a tourist sport. But for those of us who spend a lot of time climbing for the sake of climbing and experimenting, we're not just following a rope. We're not just following someone in lead of us. We're exploring and going sideways. And a perfect example is in 1981, after the residency and after a year in Durango, I went to southern Arizona again, living in the Chiricahua Mountains, and I was the chef. My daughter and her husband ran this camp, and I was the chef. I put out 120 meals 3 times a day. Well, every now and then I got a break. I took my 4.5-year-old granddaughter, who is now 42 years old, and we went from 6,000 feet to 9,000 feet. In that process, what we discovered was to watch her have a natural wild woman. The trip up was about 8 miles and about 2,000 elevation gain. She walked over 10 miles, searching every butterfly and every mushroom that was there. The most amazing thing I learned is that she got my genetics. Not all of my children or grandchildren got the same genetics for being in the wilderness, but I had them, and she had them naturally. She went on to become a park ranger. The beauty of what I'm trying to say to you is not everybody's attracted to the wilderness, not everyone is served. We have this notion that you can take someone in the wilderness and it'll work. For many people, it's distressful. What we have to realize is they have to have a genetic predisposition. I obviously did. My oldest granddaughter obviously did. One of my grandsons obviously has that because he would go on trips with me. So between 73 and 79, I'm learning what it means to be in the wilderness. This is the most exciting time. And I have many, many stories which you'll hear. But what you're also going to hear are stories of all the people that I took in the wilderness. Many times also, the times that I went alone or that I went with my wife Jean, or I went with colleagues. Those experiences in a private setting were the grist for the mill for doing a public setting. So I took out men initially who wanted major transformation. Then my wife and I took out couples. Then we took on families. Then we took out young people who were coming out of treatment centers for alcoholism, and took the family and the young person at the end of treatment to reintegrate into the family. It was amazing how the wilderness. I had to learn this first. I had to learn, what does the wilderness do? I said it also impacts in a way that you can lose a relationship. How ironic is that I would lose that relationship? But it also impacts in a way that I found my soul once again. And since that time, since 1973, I've lived a soul-directed life. And I give the credit to that, to my time in the wilderness. The making of Self, Soul, Spirit has a scientific basis. The wilderness applied to that has the basis of living. We all come from the wilderness. Now here's the sad note. I wrote a paper 50 years ago that by this time many people had had mutations to live by the light switch and the thermostat. When it was cold, they ran it up. When it was hot, they ran it down. When it was dark, they turned it on. When it was light, they turned it off. They have no concept of moon cycles, sun cycles. They have no concept of what the wilderness means. They are now mutated to a point that they experience. Now, here's the amazing thing. Some of those same people, without knowing it, have a genetic predisposition. I had a lab assistant when I taught college in experimental psychology. She was so citified, she never even wanted a house. She lived in a major apartment in Phoenix. No cutting lawn for her, no flowers, up and down the elevator. She decided to do a trip down the Grand Canyon. I told her what to look for. She came home. She said, my life just got transformed. She went out and she bought hiking boots. It changed her whole life. Now, if you have that genetic predisposition, and if in fact you meet the wilderness head on, you will be impacted. If you don't have that genetic predisposition, you may see the wilderness as dangerous. For me, a traffic jam in downtown Phoenix or downtown Manhattan is a lot worse wilderness for danger than I could imagine. There's very little danger. And yes, I've had hundreds of animal encounters. Of all the rattlesnake encounters I've had, I've never been struck. I honor who they are. They don't strike me. Bears, same thing. I do not go up to a grizzly who's feeding on a stream getting his trout or getting his salmon, because that's his territory and his time. But I might see him from a distance and wave at him. I've had hundreds of black bear, and they're not interested in attacking you unless you somehow have had encounters. Under those circumstances, it's totally different. But the truth of the matter is, I've also had hundreds of encounters with skunks, and I've never been sprayed. As a matter of fact, my attachment to animals goes back to when I was in high school. When I was in high school and I graduated the first year, I went to college. Why, in the summer I needed a job and I went to camps, and I was the recreational director of the camp. That means you throw out the tennis balls and the basketballs and the baseballs. Well, the kitchen had skunks in it, and every morning those skunks had to be swept out before the chefs would come and cook. They kept looking to how they were sneaking into the kitchen at night, but hadn't found it yet. My job was to get the skunks out of the kitchen. I never thought anything about it when I was handed the job. Skunks aren't a problem as long as you're not threatening them. So I'd take a broom and I'd sweep behind them, and I named them and I called them by their names. And in the week or so that I was at camp, when I entered the kitchen after the third day, they started making their way to the back door, which I had opened up and propped it open, and they went away. The most amazing thing that happened to me around skunks is that if you look at my mandala, all of the parts of my mandala have animal symbols. And the skunk came to me in a most interesting way. This is one of the wilderness stories that I'll tell that has very little to do with therapeutic wilderness. This man at 38 had a heart attack, very successful in the film industry. He was terrified by the heart attack and never wanted to get too far away from the hospital in case he had another one. And he came to me and we did some work, and he said, I want you to take me in the wilderness, not because I particularly want to do a lot of therapeutic transformational change, but simply because I want to know that I can be away from the hospital and not panic. But he says, I need to know that you will only go in so far and that you can run out and get help if necessary. I said, that's no big deal. We went into a beautiful area in a gorgeous canyon with a creek and many little caverns, so we didn't set up tents. And these were more grotto-like because they'd been carved out by the creek itself. So while we're in there, we're really talking just about what it feels like to not have to be close to a hospital. And each day passed and he became more relaxed. And every day, at the end of the day, we would have a lovely meal and kind of go over what it was like, and he was relaxing more and more. And I would do a couple visualizations and he would respond to those. And the whole thing was feeling safe off the road. Well, one night, I'd put everything away, and we'd gone to bed, and it was somewhere around midnight. I smelled this terrible odor, and I looked down at the bottom of my sleeping bag, and here's a skunk. Now, the skunk did not shit on my sleeping bag. The skunk shit next to my sleeping bag. But he looked at me, and we had this conversation. And here's what he said. You hung up all the food. You didn't leave a scrap around the fire. Everything's all put away. I'm one of your brothers. Don't you get it? We've never sprayed you. And I had this amazing epiphany, and the skunk became part of my mandala. Those things don't just happen unless you're out there. And when you're out there, it's totally different. How do we know there are energies passing back and forth? Well, I'm going to do the science part of it, the physics and the metaphysics part of it, and the Buddhist part of it. For centuries, the Buddhists have said we're all connected. Therefore, we're all connected. You don't need a self. You just translate right into being part of the universe. But many Buddhists believe, no, you have to have a self before you give it up. Those of you who have read Siddhartha know exactly what I'm talking about. Physics, as of late now, has joined them. And they said, no, there's no such thing as space. Everything is connected, and that explains why energy fields move in and around each other. We even now have galaxies entering galaxies. We know that for our own phenomena, the next thing is that anything that has a body is unique. There are no two butterflies alike. There are no two humans alike, not even identical twins. The minute the zygote splits into two, they develop similar and different genes. The most amazing thing is everything that has a body is unique and everything is connected. That explains why these energy fields can move between us and among us. It's why in places like AA, they say seek out a higher power. It's like in Christianity, people seek out guardian angels. Regardless of the base from which those theoretical notions are created, the essence is this, that we have energy and we move through energy and we have a soul that it will pass on from this body. Our souls are unique. Our bodies are unique. The beauty is, with the uniqueness, we still are connected. A simple example on the basis of medicine is in the 1980, when I was studying all these people that got the HIV virus. It was amazing. Some were exposed to the virus, did not get AIDS. They did not get it. They did not get the HIV virus because biology is attraction and connection. Here comes the virus. If it's not given an attraction by certain cells, it passes out. Same with cancer. Same with all kinds of infectious diseases. They have to connect. We're now discovering that about Ebola. Not everybody exposed to the Ebola virus gets it. Some it passes through. We're now looking at are there genetic factors? Are there factors that have been built up to resist that virus? The universe operates on the basis of functionality. The most functional phenomena is in our Earth. We have tried to override the elements and we create things to get around. We drive cars instead of walking. When you're in the wilderness and you're away from all kinds of vehicles and you walk, you come back to where we started in the early days of our being on the earth. Now, are there energies, phenomena in the wilderness? Yes. People that have worked with animals for years will tell you that if you pay attention to the animal will try to talk to you in the animal's language at the same time you're talking to the animal. Animals converse and they understand each other. They understand us. A recent story that's just being bantered about. A mother grizzly had two little ones and they were trying to cross the shallow lake. Mother and one of them got to the other shore and the last one, the little baby, was floundering. Two men who were fishing saw this whole occurrence and they pushed their boat forward very rapidly. And as they came up, they slowed down and then one man jumped out and took the little grizzly, pushed it in to get to mother. Then the guy in the boat said to him, "Get back in real quick. That grizzly's coming your way." And the guy turned around and looked at the grizzly. And he said, "I don't think she's dangerous. I don't feel any energy coming." The grizzly walked up and gave the man a hug. You can't make that stuff up. I have many, many stories of those kinds of encounters. They're in our papers all the time, of rescues, things of that nature, of dogs waking us up in a burning fire, on and on and on. What I did was to spend a lot of time communicating with those animals. Then, when I took people out, I got them to try to carry on conversations or to sit in vigilance and to be with them. The key about wilderness is that if you are open to the wilderness and if you have a genetic predisposition to wildness, that will connect with you and things will happen. Over the course of the next few podcasts, I'll be telling many, many stories of people's lives and what happened to them in the wilderness. Not all of them are easily and happy, some are tough. As I look at these mountains, though, I'm reminded of two quick stories. One of the things that happens when you're going to medical school, you devote the next 20 years to hang out around hospitals. That's all there is to it. So you go from internships to residencies to fellowships, etc., etc. And in doing that, if you had been an outdoors person before, you lose track of that. In the middle of my wilderness encounter, two physicians independently came to me. One was going to go into ER, and one was going into a practice of internal medicine. Both wanted to reclaim their wilderness. I'm going to have stories about the internist because he's writing them up for me right now. I'm not in contact with the one who went into ER, but I can tell his story. Mount McKinley, the highest continental mountain, is only a short distance from Mount Thomas. Everybody goes up McKinley like it's, the Mecca. But nobody goes to Thomas. You can stand on Thomas and see McKinley a few miles north. So I took him into Thomas, and we had a base camp of 12,000 feet. Then we made the ascent to the 14,000 top peak. And it was a difficult ascent. He climbed the mountain 10 times. I climbed the mountain once. What do I mean by that? 9 times he stopped and questioned whether he could make it to the top. 9 times I sat with him with no intention, no agenda, no outcome. I was satisfied when we left base camp. If he didn't do any more, I wasn't there to bag a peak. I wasn't there for him to have some accomplishment. I was there for him to feel his energy at a high altitude and how it reacted on him. We'd already had great days at a lake in the Sierras, and there's a great story about the golden trout, which I'll tell in the podcast later on. Each time he got up, and when he got up on the 9th time, after we'd been through some really tough scree, and we were back on a relatively easy climb, he said, I'm aware that I could have stopped any time, and you'd have been fine with me. I didn't have to prove anything to you. I said, you're right. He said, I was aware that I was only proving to myself. You're right. I was aware there was no one else around who would give a shit. I said, you're right. He said, I'm glad I made it, but now I realize I could have never been out of base camp at 12,000 feet. I did not have to come to the top of this mountain to be okay. And that's what he took home. The idea of bagging a peak is ridiculous. Everest is strung with dead bodies with the idea of bagging a peak. We could turn around when I take people in the wilderness, or we could cut it short. This man came down, he kept up his climbing, and went to work as an ER physician.